Cat House Band. If you weren't a fan, thank you so much. That was awesome. I see you, Mike. Thank you very much. I want to just take a quick moment to say happy anniversary to my wife, Carrie. 17 years. Well, you're a large reason why I'm here today. And so, this song is like, how did I get here? Look around, right? I will get started. My name is Bernal Cruz. Thank you for having me here again. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here. Most of us have not had a linear spiritual path. Mine certainly is not. Mine seemed at first more like a predetermined process with institutional blinders, unquestioned traditions, and the virtue of obedience always present to keep us from deviating really too much. I suspect a lot of folks here can relate. In fact, I wasn't familiar with the somewhat silly term recovering Catholic until I started interacting with some of the folks in this sanctuary. In my family, there are Catholics and there are rebels. But the rebels really just become evangelists. Or in the case of my dear grandmother, Seventh-day Adventists. I know this story already seems all over the place, right? Non-linear, remember? But we'll get there together, I promise. I have this clear memory of being at a church in my hometown of Guatemala City. It was my neighborhood church. It was a small church, and there we would see my classmates and their families. There was always this girl who would run to my mom and tell her all the naughty things I did during school that last week. Like something about having to confess sins generally, even when they're not yours, I suppose. And my mom was really cool. First she'd act appalled and then just ignore her. Well, one Sunday after communion, one of my friends' mom was sitting next to me, another friend. It was all real quiet. It was that moment of, sort of solemn prayer after communion, if you're not familiar, where she suddenly started speaking in tongues. And to me, it just made me very uneasy and frankly kind of sent a chill down my spine. I'd never really experienced anything like that before. And later I would hear from other congregants that this was unusual for our church, and this sort of charismatic practice wasn't really in place at our church. Now, I didn't understand much, but whatever she did, not cool. It was not considered acceptable at our church. To me, again, just very confusing, right? Meanwhile, my grandmother would sometimes visit on the weekends, and she would not, like the rest of the family, cross herself when we drove by that church. The symbol of the church, the big cross, would immediately trigger an obligatory crossing of yourself. But not for my grandmother. She would tell us that the Bible didn't teach us to revere or adore symbols like crosses or statues or even the Virgin Mary. Hers was a totally different church. For one, their services were so very long. And I cannot, in all honesty, tell you anything, not one thing I ever learned there. I spent my entire time wondering, when will this be over? My grandma was raised Catholic, and she turned away from that eventually and became an Adventist. Her sister, one of her sisters anyways, she remained a Catholic, but she married an evangelist. So grandma and her brother-in-law, they saw eye to eye on many things while still being surrounded by Catholics at family events. So internally, the family must have felt that there was a great vast difference between their beliefs. And I was mostly unaware of it, of course. And as I get older, I did start seeing some of those differences. But then we, as a family, we moved to the US when I was a teenager, and we lived with my grandparents. So now I spend a lot more time at the Adventist church. But now in in Gresham, Oregon. And I was older, but I also cannot tell you any lesson I ever learned there. I remember mostly their vegetarian diet and how my dear true carnivore grandmother must have suffered in order to observe those tenets of their beliefs. So I'd like to take you way back, 16th century. This is not a history lesson, I promise. As you all know, the Spanish crown saw it necessary when they arrived in these new lands to convert indigenous people to Catholicism. It was considered the duty of the crown. With civilization, they also brought us salvation. Columbus wrote in his journals that the people of this new land would make great Christians because they seemed so docile and obedient. Probably make pretty good slaves too. This is part of the contradiction, if not the whole contradiction, right? The system that brought a spiritual framework to my ancestors also arrived carrying violence, exploitation, and they stole gold and precious stones and gems. Spain sent priests and men of the cloth to assist in this conversion. They encountered writings of the Maya, spiritual practices, and almost all of these texts were burnt, buried, never to be seen again, disappeared forever. Records of astronomy, cultivation, history, mathematics, but not the spiritual principles of the Maya cosmovision. Somehow, poetically, the most sacred book survived, the Popol Vuh, which is currently available for viewing in France, not Guatemala. Maya cosmovision does not exist today simply because that book survived. It survives because the worldview itself was carried through generations. It teaches that the universe is living, interconnected, and divine, that nature, humanity, and the sacred exist through complete interdependence. It is woven into everyday life. It's guided by an observable calendar and rituals that seek to maintain balance with all cosmic forces. These concepts did not need to be rediscovered. They needed only to be protected and remembered. So over time, Catholicism and Maya cosmovision sort of come to coexist. Not necessarily in competition if you ask the Maya people. See, in cosmovision, everything exists under God, including Catholicism. Catholics and Christians, however, they speak to us of a jealous God. One who tells us in the commandments that he is a jealous God, and he will not tolerate the worship of other deities. So one worldview emphasizes singular devotion, while another understood sacred presence as existing throughout creation. Maya traditions recognize many sacred beings and forces. Chak is the deity of rain, the god of rain. It's Sanma, associated with the heavens, night and day. Kukulkan, one of the famous feather serpents, many others. And yes, the history of how it all unfolded is complex. But no matter what path you follow, and no matter whose book you've read, or no matter whose account was presented to you at some point, the fact is that Catholicism became the dominant spiritual framework. It spread throughout the region and sought to eradicate Maya beliefs. But the Maya are resilient, if nothing else. So back to the 21st century. Not long ago, I took a trip to Guatemala. I ended up in my dad's hometown, Coban. And there on top of a hill, sits an old colonial church, one of the oldest actually. It's white, has this large cross that can be seen from far, far away. It's a pretty standard Catholic church by all accounts. And outside of the church, where the land leads into this vast forest, there's a hole in the ground where Maya shamans still light ceremonial fire to continue their spiritual practices. They pray to the universe. They connect with the earth. They bring offerings to the forest and ask Mother Earth to forgive us for the harm we often cause. Maya everyday people come there to pray for their loved ones, for anyone who's fallen ill, for those who have fallen on hard times, and for the safe passage of those who have found the other side. Now, I learned that the Maya, they're not simply riding some spiritual coattails of a church or some place where adoration happens. Instead, the church was built on Maya sacred ground, where the Maya believe that there is an opening into the underworld, Xibalba, and a true connection to the heavens above, on top of a hill, harmony. So after the church was built, Maya people went away, but they slowly returned to practice there. Today, it is a normal and accepted sight to see a shaman outside the church, burning incense and copal, praying in Quechua, not in Spanish, and it is also very common to see all kinds of people just taking pictures of them, but that's a whole other story. A lot of traditions coexist in ways that as a child growing up there just felt normal. Semana Santa, Holy Week, it's filled with a blend of Catholic and Maya influences. Some new, some old. They've become integrated into the culture, and they are actually things we're really proud of. There's not a lot of questioning. I apologize, I keep losing my place here. There's not a lot of questioning or dissecting the origins of these things, especially when you're living out of these traditions. You're living out the traditions. But what happens when you step away? You gain perspective and objectivity. And this is how my unlearning process began. I haven't yet had some super angry response to Catholics or Catholicism, and maybe it's still coming. But my process began by asking the most fundamental question. Do I even conceive of myself as a spiritual being? And for a long time, the answer was no. Therefore, I was never really in need of a spiritual practice or some way to connect to anything bigger than myself. Life eventually presented me with enough challenges, right? And praying seemed like the thing to do. But it always felt unclear. I didn't know who was on the receiving end of these prayers or whether I had any right to pray at all. I felt undeserving of the attention and the love of God, of kind spirit. I felt abandoned in my place, and that I had abandoned it. It's such a classic human experience, right? Only when we feel the grip of life around our throat do we say, "Why have you abandoned me?" My need to understand these things also came from a social justice perspective. I felt hurt, deeply hurt, knowing that sacred beliefs and sacred places and sacred books had been violated, and I wanted to reclaim some of that. One day I shared with one of my spiritual teachers that I had begun to feel depleted and weak. I kept learning about trauma, my own, other people's, institutional, generational trauma. And it felt like it was piling up. It had begun to really suffocate me, and I needed to believe in something. If I was going to believe that I carry within me the story of my ancestors, then I must also carry within me their resilience and their strength. But I didn't feel it. I didn't feel strong at all. I felt tired and I felt spent. Well, we went into a ceremony that night, and the most amazing thing happened. I felt and I saw in my heart eyes that were peering through broad leaves and trees in a jungle. Eyes of all kinds. They tried to hide from me at first, but eventually they revealed themselves. And they were the eyes of birds, like toucans and parrots and owls. And then the eyes of howler monkeys and tapirs and jaguars. Slowly, they all came out of the shadows. There was no message in words, but their presence was enough. You were looking for strength? Here we are. All of us in numbers for you. And here I was looking for the strength of my grandpa or my uncles. But instead, kind spirit sent me a message, an unequivocal message. You have the love of the earth, the forest, the birds, and the night. There is no greater strength than that. I understood. Kind spirit found me again. Kind spirit said to me, Mother Earth and your cosmic family, they've always been here with you. Welcome back. And so my heart and my eyes were open again. I did. I inherited a lot of traditions and the deep pain of colonization. I even inherited the virtue of obedience. But it was my interest in social justice that compelled me to understand that kind spirit was always within me, and that I would be found easily if I opened my heart and reclaimed the spiritual place where I have always belonged. I began to see things differently. And Carrie was so very supportive. She had a very similar concept. It's her story. But my practice became my own, a solo practice, if you will. I began to invite my family in some of my ways of connecting with earth and kind spirit. We bring offerings to the forest, like tobacco, when we go foraging for mushrooms. We use copal, a tree resin, in ceremony to cleanse our home and observe the changes of the calendar. I participate in ceremonies to honor the universe and our interconnectedness a couple of times a year. And we have found this church where I can connect with you all. Many of whom may be learning today why I feel like we're so much alike. A place where I don't have to explain myself, let alone defend my practice. My family, we've come here to sustain our spirit, because part of doing so is being in harmony with like-minded people, with kind hearts and kind souls, who are here to care for one another and to be cared for by Kahuleu, the entire universe. After all, that is the true philosophy of Maya Cosmovision. Gracias, y que así sea. Thank you. So mote it be.